Hi students. In this video we're going to take a look at a paper by Stephen J. Morse on the insanity defense. That paper is titled Excusing the Crazy, the Insanity Defense Reconsidered. So I think it's just important to point out early on that Morse is using the word crazy here just to, not in a derogatory way, just to refer to people whose behavior is bizarre. And when we talk about people who are insane, again, we're not using it in a derogatory way, just sort of using it to describe a group of people who meet certain legal conditions for insanity. So hopefully the use of these terms isn't offensive. All right, so let's take a look at the paper. So first things first, right, we want to think about what's the author's thesis? What's Morse trying to convince us of? And according to Morse, right, those who think that we should get rid of the insanity defense must show either A, that no one is ever insane at the time of their offense, or B, that those who are insane at the time of their offenses deserve to be convicted and punished. So either no one's ever insane, or people who are insane deserve to be convicted and punished. If you can show one of those two things, then you would show that, yeah, we should get rid of the insanity defense. But Morse doesn't think that's possible, so he doesn't think it's possible to show that A or B is true, so he doesn't think we should get rid of the insanity defense. So that's the sort of the thesis. His argument for that thesis, we've already sort of given it, but just to put it in standard form, you might say premise one is this: if we should get rid of the insanity defense, then either A or B must be true. Either A, no one's ever insane at the time of their offense, or B, those who are insane at the time of their offenses always deserve to be convicted and punished. Premise 2 says, well, A is not true. Premise 3 says B is not true. This argument's kind of like modus tollens, right? If A, then B or C, and premise 2 and 3 say, well, not B or C. Therefore, the conclusion is not the antecedent of the conditional in premise 1. So therefore, we shouldn't get rid of the insanity defense. That's the argument. So what we're going to do is we're going to, look at premise 1. We think maybe premise 1 seems pretty plausible. Let's look at the support for premise 2 and 3, premises 2 and 3. All right, so as support for premise 2, remember premise 2 is saying that A is not true. What does A say? A says that no one is ever insane at the time of their offense. So Morse says, well, they're just counterexamples to this claim. So imagine someone who has a delusional belief that a group of people are out to kill him, so he kills one of the people who's plotting that the murder. Now, Daniel M'Naughton, Daniel M'Naughton is sort of famous because he was one of the first people to use the insanity defense to sort of get him out of being punished. And so his case is kind of a popular one, and there's this thing called the M'Naughton rule, which talks about, the conditions really that someone needs to meet in order to be sort of to count as insane, such that they could get off from a crime. But in his case, I'm going to mess up the details, but roughly he sort of thought that there was these people who were out to get him, and he sort of had this mistaken belief that this one guy who wasn't really all that important was actually like a really important figure, like the king of his town or whatever, and he kind of thought that the king was plotting against him, so he killed that guy. Anyway, he was confused. He was definitely mistaken about the facts. Crazy in the way that Morse would use that term, and just sort of had bizarre beliefs about the world that didn't really match reality. So someone like that Morse says is insane at the time of the offense. So this person's mental state, right, Morse suggests, fits our conception of insanity, in which case A is false. So A says no one's ever insane, but we just can imagine people who are, and so A is not true. All right, that was Morse's support for premise 2. Now we're going to look at his support for premise 3. Remember, premise 3 said that B is not true, B is false. What did B say? So, according to B, those who are insane at the time of their offenses always deserve to be convicted and punished. So, B is sort of admitting, we might think, yeah, there are people who are insane at the time of their offenses, but whenever they are, they should be convicted and punished. Morse says showing this would involve showing that those who are insane at the time of their offenses meet the minimal conditions for responsibility, and he lists what those are. So the first one, he says minimal rationality. In other words, like they have cognitive capacity. The idea here is that we don't hold children or animals responsible for their behavior because they're not minimally rational, but people like adults, the average, the ordinary adult has the minimal rationality to be responsible. The other condition for responsibility is there can't be any coercion or compulsion. This is not cognitive capacity as far as you've got sort of standards types of beliefs. And the ability to sort of think through things in the ordinary sort of way, that's cognitive capacity. Volitional capacity comes to like freedom of the will. So are you free to do what you want to do, basically here? And so to sort of show that this is a condition for responsibility, we might just point out that we don't hold people who are being held at gunpoint responsible for their behavior, right? Because we think, well, those people are being coerced. So there's good reason to think that in order to be responsible for your behavior, you've got to be minimally rational and not be coerced or subject to compulsion. Now, this sort of makes me think that it'd be good to draw a kind of diagram to help you sort of see what's going on here. So we've drawn a diagram last time to look at sort of like how luck can impact actions, and maybe I shouldn't say actions, but affect the intentions we form, the acts that we do, the consequences that we bring about. But this diagram is about moral responsibility, so I'm going to call it the responsibility diagram. So I think a pretty typical way of thinking about the connection between responsibility and punishment is that like you need to be responsible in order to deserve punishment. I think there's even a sort of a middle stage. So I think when you have more responsibility and you do something wrong, so you're responsible for an act, and that act was wrong, then you're going to be blameworthy for the act. Now, blameworthiness alone probably isn't enough to deserve punishment, but when you're blameworthy for something, right, you did something morally wrong, and that thing was also legally wrong, then you're going to be deserving of punishment, or sort of in a position where the state is going to be justified in punishing you. But the thing that we're really interested in here that Morse is sort of looking at is this moral responsibility. What does it take to be morally responsible? So that's what we're sort of interested in. And he identifies, right, these two sort of branches, right, minimal rationality, and there can't be any coercion or compulsion. Now, I think there's a third branch that Morse is not talking about, but it makes a lot of sense to think that there's this other piece, and that's information. So when we hold someone responsible for what they're doing, we think that like they've got to be rational, they've got to know what they're up to, generally speaking. They need to have information, like not just that they're rational, but that they have true beliefs that people that they're not like deeply deceived about the way the world is or something along those lines. And then that they can't be being compelled or held at gunpoint or threatened or something along those lines. So, so we've got the two sort of conditions that Morse identifies, and then this other one, which maybe is not too important. I don't know. I do think it is kind of important. We'll see that later. But maybe we can explain insanity without it. But I think it's useful to have in there. Okay, we'll come back to this diagram in a minute. So continuing on, sort of this train of thought, Moore says, do those who are insane at the time of their offenses have minimal rationality? Well, we need to know, what does it take to have minimal rationality? First, you have to have intelligible ends or goals. So it's got to make sense, like what you're trying to accomplish. If you're going to be rational, you've got to be able to make sense of like why you're doing the things that you're doing. Another piece of that is that you've got to be proficient in choosing the means by which to accomplish your ends or your goals. So we can look at some examples here. Those who are insane at the time of their offenses do not necessarily meet these criteria. So I think here Morse is going to be pointing out that some people who are insane lack these features that you would need to be responsible, and if they're not responsible, then they're not going to be deserving of punishment. So let's take a look at some examples, right? Imagine someone whose goal is to be a Martian. We might think, I just don't understand why that's your goal. So another example people use in philosophy is, imagine someone who really wants to count all the blades of grass in some field. We just think, like, why do you want to do that? Now maybe they could make it rational to us, right? Maybe they could explain, like, oh, if you're a Martian, then you get a bunch of gold when you die, or something like that. It's like, okay, now I'm starting to understand. But without any other context, right, that goal just doesn't make sense. Number two, so that's like, we've got to have intelligible goals. Somebody who wants to be a Martian doesn't seem to have intelligible goals. Two, you need to be proficient in choosing the means by which to accomplish the goals. So say you want to bring about peace on Earth. That makes perfect sense. Like, we get it. But if somebody gouges his eye out because he believes that mutilating himself will produce peace on Earth, that person isn't proficient in choosing the means by which to accomplish his ends or goals. So peace on Earth, that makes perfect sense. But like, why are you gouging out your eyes? That doesn't make any sense. That person's not minimally rational in the way that you need to be in order to be responsible. And if you need to be responsible in order to deserve punishment, well, then that's a problem. All right, so if we return to the diagram, we can just think, oh, minimal rationality requires two things, right? It requires intelligible goals, and it requires this other thing, which is proficient means and reasoning. If we don't have one of those things, then we don't have minimal rationality. If we don't have minimal rationality, we don't get moral responsibility. If we don't get moral responsibility, then we're not going to get blameworthiness or justified punishment, that sort of thing. What he's going to try and show next is that there are some people who are insane at the time of their offense, who are compelled, who are coerced. And if you are coerced or compelled, then you're not going to be morally responsible. So punishment's not going to be appropriate in your case. So again, let's return to thinking about premise 3, right? And we can ask this question: are those who are insane at their time, the time of their offense, coerced or compelled to do what they do? To answer that, we need to know what it takes to be coerced or compelled. And the answer is that you're legally compelled, coerced, when obeying the law is just too demanding. When the law is expecting you to do something that is too hard to expect. It's too much to expect of someone. So, for example, someone who is forced to choose between killing an innocent person and watching their family be killed is legally compelled to kill the innocent person. Now, it's not like they're causally compelled, right? They could refrain from killing the innocent person, but we think it's asking too much to ask them to refrain from killing the innocent person and therefore watch their family be killed. We sort of, we don't like it, but we say, yeah, I understand why you did that. One is not legally compelled when obeying the law is not too demanding. So, if someone is forced to choose between killing an innocent person and watching their least favorite television show, we're not going to think, oh, well, you're justified in killing the innocent person. No, we think we can expect you not to watch, to sort of suffer through your least favorite television show in order to save the life of that innocent person. Okay, so then Morse wants to say, those who are insane at the time of their offenses sometimes meet this criterion for being coerced, being compelled. And if they are sometimes coerced or compelled, right, they're not going to be morally responsible. So, for example, someone who falsely believes that they must kill an innocent person in order to save the life of their family is legally compelled to kill that person, right? So here what we see is that someone could have a false belief that leads them to think that they're compelled when really they're not. So the idea here is like, maybe you're not really forced to choose between killing an innocent person and watching your family be killed, but you sort of believe it because you're in the grip of some delusion. That would be, someone who's insane might be in that kind of case. All right, so if we return to the argument, I think there are good reasons to think that premise 2 and premise 3 are true. That is, some people are sometimes insane at the time of their offense, right? A is false and B is false. Those who are insane at the time of their offense don't always deserve to be convicted and punished. And so one thing we might ask at this point is like, well, which premise is the most controversial? If we've got good evidence for premise 2 and 3, we might sort of start to wonder, well, maybe premise 1 is false. Maybe it's true that, so if we should get rid of the insanity defense, maybe the truth of that claim is consistent with the falsity of A and B. I recognize that's a little tricky. I went through that too fast in a way, but the point is, maybe it's possible for the antecedent of this premise to be true and the consequent to be false. And I think the main idea here is going to be a kind of utilitarian theory about punishment. So maybe we should, even though some people are insane at the time of the offense and don't really deserve punishment, it just is useful to punish them anyway. But let's look at premise 1 and some objections to it. All right, so one objection to premise 1, maybe the best one or the most obvious one, is that sort of what I've just suggested, even if those who are insane at the time of their offenses don't deserve to be convicted and punished, we should still punish them anyway, because doing so, is useful. It maximizes happiness. So that would be one potential objection. I'm not going to spend too much time dwelling on that objection. That objection depends on, again, getting back to this debate about utilitarianism or altruism about punishment. And I think, in a way, we shouldn't look to what we think about the insanity defense to give us an answer to that debate. We should look to more standard cases to help us sort out whether we should be utilitarians or not about theories of punishment. And whatever we sort of think about that question, then maybe that can inform what we want to say here about whether or not we should allow the insanity defense. All right, so let's talk about Gary Cameron, the case we looked at. State versus Cameron, where he kills his stepmother by stabbing her 70 times. He thinks she's a demon, that sort of thing. Should he be excused? In order to answer that question, we need to ask sort of these two other questions for Morse. Question one, was he minimally rational? And it looks like the answer here is that yes, he was minimally rational. Now, I think this can be kind of tricky. I think some people think the answer is no. Here's why I think yes. First, I think his ends or goals were intelligible. So I can't blame the guy for wanting to kill a demon, right? If he thought that his stepmother was a demon, then like that makes perfect sense that he would want to kill her. Now you might say, well, why did he think she was a demon, right? I think that's a legitimate question, but that's not a question about do his goals make sense? Like, if you say, well, why is he trying to kill a stepmother? Yeah, that doesn't make sense. But once he tells you, it's because I thought she was a demon, then it's like, oh yeah, we get it. We understand why you were doing that. I also think that he was proficient in choosing the means by which to accomplish his ends or goals. So, again, this maybe sounds like kind of funny, but the thought is stabbing a demon over 70 times seems like a good way to kill it. So if your goal is to kill a demon or to please God or something like that, and God's telling you to stab the demon or whatever, stabbing a demon, like that's a good way to kill it. So if that's your goal, that seems like you're actually functioning properly here. So were you minimally rational? My inclination is to say yeah, he was. Was he coerced or compelled? Here, I think maybe he was coerced or compelled. And this, you might say, John, come on, how could that be? But you might say, who was coercing him? Who was compelling him to do the thing that he was doing? And my answer here would be, well, it seems like God was coercing him or compelling him, right? This belief that he had, according to which God wanted him to kill this demon, well, God was sort of putting pressure on him and telling him to break the law. And it might be too much to expect someone to disobey God when they think God's telling them to do something like this. So, as I say here, expecting Cameron to obey the law may have been too demanding. It was asking too much of him, given his belief that his stepmother was a demon and that God wanted him to kill her. So, let's look at our diagram, right? I think if we say, we're sort of trying to figure out, is Cameron morally responsible such that he could be deserving of punishment, or punishment could be appropriate? Well, we need him to be responsible. Is he minimally rational? I think. Does he have intelligible goals? Yes. Is he proficient at means and reasoning? Yes. And if he's good at both of those things, then he's minimally rational. So we're good there. What about the information piece, the coercion compulsion piece? I think here's where things start to break down. So I think, is he informed? Does he have like an accurate view of the world? I think the answer to that question is no. He doesn't really understand what's going on. Now, this is a piece that Morse hasn't talked much about, but that I think is kind of central to understanding what's going on here. So he thinks that his stepmother is a demon. That's a big mistake. But if you make that mistake, if you think that, then we can start to understand why he did the thing that he did. But it's also going to be a reason to think he's not really responsible for what he did. We can't blame him for doing the thing that he did because he had this like really bizarre view. And I think it's that mistake about the information that also maybe means that he was coerced or compelled, right? Given his thought that his stepmother was a demon, given his thought that God wanted him to kill her, well then he's put in a tough spot, right? How can we expect him to obey the law when it's like either obey the law or obey God? It seems like in a case like that, the appropriate thing to do, right? the sort of the reasonable thing to do is to obey God if you think like God's all powerful and he'll send you to hell if you disobey him and things like that. So I think that the problem here is not that he wasn't minimally rational. I think he seemed rational. It's rather that he had these sort of bizarre beliefs, and the bizarre beliefs led him to be coerced or compelled by the deific decree, by God's command. And since, he doesn't have full information, the fact that he is being coerced or compelled means that he's not responsible, right? We can put an X there. If he's not responsible, he's not going to be blameworthy, and he's not going to be the appropriate subject of punishment. All right, so sort of in closing, I want to just look at why might someone think that Cameron shouldn't be excused? Now, the answer to this, here's just one suggestion. I think this is kind of plausible, right? So if I'm trying to motivate you to let's think about both sides here. So it does seem like Cameron was capable of deciding between murdering his stepmother and going to jail on the one hand, and B, not murdering her and not going to jail. So it seems like he had a choice and he understood sort of what his options were. So you can murder your stepmother, in which case you're probably going to go to jail, or you can not murder your stepmother and not go to jail. Now you can believe in God all you want, and maybe it's good to believe him, but maybe sometimes God calls you to do things that are going to have bad consequences for you, like going to jail. Maybe you should be willing to go to jail if it means killing a demon or something like that. So you might just think we can't let people have this kind of excuse that they're going to be able to use to get out of punishment. Yeah, he had these sort of bizarre views, but he knew that what he was doing was illegal. He knew that what he was doing was going to get him thrown in jail. And if he still made that choice, then he's got to face the consequences. That's sort of one way to think about it. Why might someone think that we should get rid of the insanity defense? Sort of more generally, it might be for these kind of utilitarian reasons that I've been suggesting. But another reason you might think that we could get rid of the insanity defense is that a lot of the time people who are insane don't meet the criteria we need to be guilty and deserving of punishment. So in the law, for criminal cases, the thought is that we need to have what's called actus reus and mens rea. So actus reus is a guilty act, and mens rea is a guilty mind. So in this case, we might think, well, Cameron had a guilty act, right? He killed his stepmother, but he doesn't have a guilty mind. That is, he didn't have sort of the ill intention or something to get him the sort of some real severe penalty here. And so we don't really need to appeal to the insanity defense at all. We can just point out yeah, well, he wasn't really a bad dude who was just out to kill someone. He was a good dude in a sense. He was trying to protect the world from demons. Now, whether or not that really is going to get us what we want is unclear. I think another thing to note, just sort of before we wrap up, excuse me, is that oh man, now I lost my train of thought. The one thing I wanted to say is that it's important to note that just because someone uses the insanity defense doesn't mean they're going to get off scot-free, right? It's not for Cameron, the choice is between going home and being perfectly free or going to prison for the rest of your life. It's often a choice between going to a mental institution and going to prison. And you might think in a lot of these cases it's actually more appropriate for these people to go to a mental institution somewhere that can deal with them and the sort of psychological problems that they're having better than a prison, right? Prison may be a really horrible place for someone with paranoid schizophrenia or something like that to be put. So I think we can think like, yeah, the insanity defense is a good thing as long as it's not. It doesn't mean like people who commit these sort of really violent crimes are just like put back out on the street, but rather that they're getting the treatment that they need to be on their own again and safe, sort of productive members of society. All right, so in closing, I just want to leave you with this question. I think this is sort of like the big question behind this paper, and that question is, should we excuse the illegal acts of people like Cameron who are insane at the time of their offense? Should we punish them? Maybe for sort of like utilitarian reasons, or should we say like, no, we're not going to punish you because maybe we're like more like retributivist and we think they're not really responsible for their acts? Again, this sort of debate is another way that we see a practical application for the retributivism utilitarianism debate, but it also reveals some sort of like interesting things about the nature of blameworthiness and responsibility and deserving punishment, that sort of thing. Hopefully this was helpful. And that's it. So think about this question and we'll talk about it. All right, have a good one.